So this is going to be a very high-level talk, basically about how to secure authentication in your environment, in basically any identity environment. These are the common vulnerabilities that we see, and this is not AWS specific. This is broadly applicable to any identity systems. When I gave this talk, rehearsing for my mentor, he said, "There's something missing." He said, "You need a bragging slide." So he made me a bragging slide. So these are all the things I have to brag about. I'm a principal product manager at AWS Identity. My undergraduate degree is in physics. I have a master's degree in information management. I'm a co-author of the NIST Digital Identity Guidelines. So these are the guidelines that outline authentication, federation, and identity proofing standards for all federal agencies. I was a consultant for many years. My company was called Engage Identity because I have an unhealthy obsession with Captain Picard. I was a board member at the OpenID Foundation. I'm a co-founder of ID Pro, which is a professional organization for identity nerds. We'll be talking a lot more about that tomorrow. I was named one of the top 100 influencers in identity and one of the best cybersecurity female speakers. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the #1 concern in securing identity accounts, which is secret questions. And then the holy trinity of securing identity accounts, something you know, something you have, something you are. So when we talk about multi-factor authentication, these are the 3 different factors that protect against different types of attacks in identity. Or in my father's case, this would be something you'll forget, something you'll lose, and something you'll get a paper cut on. And then we'll finish up by talking about account recovery, and then we will have time for a question and answer. So secret questions, or you may also see this referred to as knowledge-based authentication. So this is the #1 way that we see accounts being popped by script kiddies. Secret questions are inherently insecure, and they're very difficult to use. So one of the first projects that I ever did in identity was at the University of Washington. We tore out their account recovery system. We tore out their secret questions, and they had data going back 10 years showing that 60% of users got their secret questions wrong in the first try, which surprises no one in this room, I'm sure. Because you created them 5 years ago when you created the account, right? So we know that it's bad usability, and we know that it's bad security, because typically when we enforce complexity requirements on passwords, we don't enforce them on secret questions. Likewise, those questions are generally things that are easy to look up on the internet, like your mother's maiden name, where you went to high school, what your high school mascot was, things like that. So the #1 thing that I want you to take away from this, if you take away nothing else, is that you should have already gotten rid of secret questions. And if you haven't, that should be your top priority. So let's talk about something you know, a shared secret, a password. We've done a lot of research on passwords. We have some new unintuitive guidance for you. So there are 3 do's, and there are 2 do nots when you're creating password policies. There is no try. Do allow special characters and spaces. If you think that people cannot remember long passwords, you are incorrect. People can remember entire plays. People can remember entire songs. And they can type those into your password fields if you let them use spaces and special characters. Allow ridiculously long passwords. You should be hashing all of your passwords, which means that storage should not be an issue. You should be able to hash them all down to the same length. So you should allow people to write an entire monologue into that password field if that's what they really want to do. I never want to see an error on your screen that says password too long. And lastly, in the do column is do compare to a breach corpus. So a breach corpus is a list of compromised credentials. It is sets of usernames and passwords that we know to be in the possession of attackers. So we know that another company has been breached, and that those sets of credentials are for sale on the dark web or already in possession of attackers. So when your users are setting a password or changing a password, what we want you to do is compare that username and password set to this breach corpus, because we know that if you let them set it to something that has already been compromised, that account itself will be compromised in short order, and it will be more work for your users and more work for you, and it sucks for everyone. And then in the do not column, do not require special characters. I told you you should allow special characters, but here's what happens when you require special characters. If I am trying to brute force your password or reverse a hash of your password, here's all the things that I have to try. I have to try a lot of different things. But if I know that there's a special character in there somewhere, then I only have to try this many things. And if I know that there's a number in there somewhere, then I only have to try this many things. And if I know that there's a capital letter in there, then I only have to try this many things, right? So we have established libraries in almost every language at this point that will tell you how much entropy is in a password. That is what you should be using. So your user should get an error that doesn't say, this password needs a capital letter. Your user should get an error that says, this password isn't very complex. It needs to be more complex, which means you can make it longer, or you can add special characters or numbers. But enforcing specific types of complexity actually makes passwords less secure. And then lastly, in the do not column, do not force password rotation. I see everyone taking a picture. Yes, email this to your CISO. We have to do it at AWS. I had to do it when I was at Ping. Lots of people still have password rotation. Here's what happens when you force people to rotate their passwords. They tend to pick things that are easy to guess, or they tend to pick things that are very similar to passwords that they've used before. And that's bad for the whole system. So a friend of mine used to work on a trading desk at Wall Street. They had to change their password at the beginning of every quarter, and everyone on the floor ended up with the same password, right? Spring 2018, exclamation point. Winter 2018, exclamation point. And we know that that's insecure. We don't want to see that sort of behavior. If a user can remember a long, complex, original password, for God's sake, let them keep it. That is a miracle. So something you have. There are a lot of different kinds of two-factor authentication solutions, and they are not all created equal. We're going to go over 5 of them, and they have different security and deployability characteristics that make them appropriate for different use cases. So when you send a one-time password over SMS, it is incredibly insecure. It is more secure than a password alone. It is better than having no two-factor authentication at all. But we know that the publicly switched telephone network has multiple vulnerabilities. We know that SMS can be sniffed with off-the-shelf hardware and software. And we know that people walk in to Best Buy and they say, hi, I'm Heather Flanagan, and I've lost my phone. And I need you to sell me this $1,000 phone that you get a commission on if you ignore the fact that I don't have an ID that says Heather Flanagan on it. And I need you to port her phone number to this phone. And then I will start getting Heather Flanagan's text messages. So why do we keep OTP via SMS around? It's incredibly deployable. It is so easy. You don't have to download anything. Almost everyone in the world can receive a text message. So that's why we keep it around. It is better than just passwords, and it is incredibly, incredibly easy to use with no training. Next up, we have OTP via app. You might think that this has the same security characteristics. You are likewise getting a short code to a phone, but in fact, it is much more secure because it is not tied to the SIM card. So you can't walk into a Best Buy and get a code from someone's application. Likewise, it doesn't go over the publicly switched telephone network. However, there are security concerns. OTP via app can be phished by phone. So I can call you up and I can say, hi, I'm Bob from IT, and we're resyncing everyone's OTPs today. And can you open up your Google Authenticator and read off to me that 6-digit code? We've seen this happen. Likewise, the OS of the phone could be jailbroken, or malware could be installed on the phone that could recover that code. But it is very deployable, right? Most people, most technology users have smartphones. They can download an app. It costs them nothing. Next, we have typed OTP via hardware. Similar security characteristics to OTP via app, but it can still be phished by phone. So you can call someone and tell them to read you that number. But it can't be read by malware from the phone's OS. So it is slightly more secure, but not at all deployable, right? Those tokens cost money. You've got to get it physically to a person and make sure that they keep it on them. Next, we have tapped OTP via hardware. So this is something like a YubiKey. This is what I use. I keep my YubiKeys on my earrings. These are Nano 5s. And the nice thing about this is that it can't be phished over the phone. By the time I read you that entire code over the phone, it wouldn't be valid anymore. So these are even more secure way of doing OTP. But they are not deployable. Again, you have to get a token to real people. And then you have FIDO via hardware. This is a really interesting one. So this actually does a cryptographic handshake with the site at the other end of the line, meaning that it has a higher level of security, but you'll notice I didn't put a 10 there. It's not perfect. And in this, I include both tokens and any form of FIDO that might be embedded in the device itself. So Android phones at this point can do FIDO authentication without a key. But FIDO authentication is still subject to a man-in-the-middle attack unless you use channel binding. So not all FIDO implementations are completely secure or completely phishing resistant. And again, not very deployable. The other thing to keep in mind when talking about something you have is that if you have multiple somethings, you might think that you are more secure and that all of your privileged access people should have multiple somethings. And that is not the case. If you have SMS and you have FIDO, the attacker only has to get through the SMS. So think of it like this picture here. You have several padlocks in series. If I can get through any one of those padlocks, I have compromised the security of that perimeter. So when you are writing privileged access management policies, you need to think about the types of things that these people have access to and which of these items you want those people to have to use. Because if you let them use all of them, you're going to end up in a situation like this, where you have a weakest link in place. And when you're writing those policies, especially, well, you can only do this when you're in the cloud. If you are in a cloud environment, rather than writing your own access management policies by hand, if it's a common access management policy that you think other companies might want as well, there's a good chance that we have what's called a managed access policy, which means that we will actually manage it for you so that when we do new deployments, we are keeping track and making sure that your security is still the way that you thought it would be before. Something you are. So lots of people come to me at AWS with great ideas about biometrics, and they know exactly how we're going to change the world with biometrics. And I always have to be a sort of wet blanket on that. Biometrics are great. They're incredibly usable, but I have some security concerns with them. So the first one is spoofing, right? We know that we leave our fingerprints everywhere, on glasses, on tables. We know that they can be lifted, and we know that they can be duplicated and spoofed. We know that iris scans can be taken from across the street, and as cameras get better and better, that'll get further and further away. We also have an issue with brute forcing. So the way that biometrics work is not like passwords. It's not an exact match. It's a probabilistic match, which means that we get false positives and we get false negatives. And it's those false positives that are the problem, because the major vendors haven't told us what their false positive rate is. So it could be that everyone in this room could put their finger on the same iPhone, and between all 10 fingers of all of these people, maybe someone will be close enough to get a false positive. So we're concerned about that. We're concerned about the ability to brute force. And then lastly, we're concerned about the lack of an ability to hash. So the difference between passwords and biometrics is that in biometrics, because you have to do that probabilistic match, you have to store the profile of the fingerprint or the iris scan encoded rather than hashed. So a hash is a one-way function. It theoretically can't be undone. If you have a hash of a password, you cannot derive the password itself, unlike an encoded fingerprint, in which case if you get a hold of the key that encoded it, you can get back to the original fingerprint, which means that these databases full of biometric fingerprints and iris scans are subject to breaches if someone steals one key. And the issue with that is that if we're storing these in the cloud, what happens if someone else's biometric database gets breached? Guess what? Your biometric database is then breached as well. Those people only have 10 fingers, right? So if we're going to do biometrics, what we have to do is keep them local to the device so that they can't be breached at scale. So this is why every time you set up a new iPhone or a new iPad, it asks you to reestablish your biometrics, because it's storing them locally on the device rather than in the cloud, so that if they do get compromised, it's only yours, so that they can't get compromised at scale. Lastly, account recovery. This is something that a lot of people do wrong, and there are two big rules that will stop you from doing it wrong. One is that authentication factors cannot act as recovery mechanisms. So if I have a password and a FIDO key that I am required to put in every time I authenticate, and I forget my password, and you ask me, oh, you forgot your password. Do you want to know your password? Put in your FIDO key. How many factors does that account have now? One. That is a one-factor authentication experience because you can derive the password from the FIDO key. So it's OK to use authentication factors as recovery mechanisms as long as you don't use them as authentication mechanisms. So if no one is allowed to use FIDO to authenticate, then you can use FIDO for recovery. That's fine. And the second rule is that recovery mechanisms cannot be weaker than authentication factors. So this is what we talked about with secret questions, right, and the complexity requirements for secret questions. If it is easier to recover the account than to get into the account, then the attacker will just recover the account. And then lastly, this is Don Bailey. We call him Beetle because Beetle Bailey. He could not be here. He is at Reinforce, which is AWS's security conference. This is the first annual year that they've done it, and apparently they didn't know about all of you wonderful people here at Identiverse because they scheduled it this week in Boston. So I asked Don, what's one thing you could tell a room full of CISOs that they should know? And it had to do with account recovery. He said, it's not just for your customers. We see our customers at AWS getting locked out of their accounts all the time, because some consultant set it up for them, and that consultant's email is on the recovery information. And as AWS, that's the person who we would go to if anyone was locked out of that account. And so you need to go through all of your accounts and make sure your recovery information is up to date. Make sure that we have multiple phone numbers, multiple email addresses for people who are allowed to recover that account. And before I finish up here, I just wanted to plug a few things. I'm doing the keynote tomorrow morning. There's going to be a big announcement about ID Pro, so don't miss that. And then at lunch tomorrow, there is an ID Pro plenary session, so please grab your lunch and head into the plenary session. We're going to talk all about what we're budgeting for next year, different member benefits that we have, and the work that we're going to be doing into the future. Tomorrow at 5 p.m., there is a Women in Identity panel at the AWS Hospitality Suite. We have a ton of women in identity at AWS for some reason. So we decided, let's put together a panel while we're all here in the same city talking about the same topic. And we are hiring. So if you want to work with wonderful women in identity, please come to the panel and talk to us. And then lastly, Wednesday night, there is an ID Pro happy hour that is happening at the Jack Rose Saloon. We got the rooftop, Okta got the dining room, so we definitely got the better deal there. So you should definitely come to our happy hour. But if you're going to do expensive drinks, like go to the Okta one first and then come upstairs to the rooftop and hang out with us. And time for Q&A. Who has questions?
Here because I was seriously biasing to the side of the room. Questions for Sarah?
All the questions are over there.
Pre-optimization is the work of the devil.
Yeah, so you had some really good stuff about like where all of these factors aren't good. So what is the right answer, right? So if we do two-factor, then our gap is bigger. But say a hacker is really looking to target a CEO or somebody in finance. How do you block that specific account?
So generally, this falls along the lines of enterprise versus consumer identity. So normally, enterprises will fall into the lower parts of that table. They'll do the more secure options because they have the ability to hand out tokens really easily. And if people lose their tokens, they have an administrator they can go to because they work in the same office, and they can go get a new token. Whereas consumers, we're generally stuck with SMS or apps, right? Consumers don't generally, people in this room accepted, have tokens that they wear as jewelry just because they're nerds.
But we love the jewelry. It's
I guess my question is really just to elaborate a little more. So if we're saying we've got these 4 factors
What is your option if all the factors are compromised?
Yes, so if they're all weak, right? So we didn't have a pin on any of them.
Oh, you want a silver bullet.
Yeah.
There's no silver bullet.
So no in there.
I'm sorry, kiddo.
So what is that option, right? When we talk about this step, where we say, hey, it is two, or we start messaging risk-based authentication?
So risk-based authentication is an interesting one. That is something we are looking at AWS. So how risky is the thing that you are trying to do, and then how much should we authenticate you on top of that? Another thing we're looking at is continuous authentication, which you'll hear a lot about in other talks. Continuous or behavioral biometrics, you might hear that word kicked around. So looking at what the user is doing. Are they getting up at a normal time of day? Are they doing the tasks that they usually do? Are they suddenly opening up databases and copying large amounts of files? Those sorts of things, counting as a factor for authentication rather than just a behavior that the user is doing to tell how much authentication we should be doing. So if we see someone doing that, we might ask them to re-authenticate or to give us a factor that they don't normally use, something like that. So yeah, we do consider risk-based authentication when we're looking at all this.
So where can one get the list, the breach corpus file? Is that available anywhere?
The list of what?
The breach corpus file, is that the list of passwords that should not be used?
So there is a website run by Troy Hunt called Have I Been Pwned? Have you been pwned? Have I been pwned? Have I been pwned? He has a downloadable breach corpus you can use. There are also commercial companies like VeriClouds where you can lease access to a list that gets constantly updated. One of the concerns with having this be a for-profit enterprise is that then some company is going out there and paying for those on the dark web, which kind of creates a vicious cycle. And we don't want to see anyone paying for these credentials because then attackers have an incentive to go and get them. And so be careful when you pay for breach corpuses, but there are some cases where it's just necessary.
Hi, Sarah. I'm Patrick Hearn. Thank you for the presentation. And I want to ask a little bit more on the lines of risk-based authentication, given I think it was approximately 4 weeks ago when the White House put out OMB 1917, which really pushed not just entities within the federal government, but really providing what I'd say a bit of a guideline to move towards risk-based authentication. You mentioned earlier that behavioral biometrics is something you're considering. Is that considering or applying it as part of the risk framework management?
At AWS, we never apply things without telling our customers. So we would never do behavioral biometrics without telling you about it. We are very open and transparent about that sort of thing. It may be a service that we offer in the future that either you pay for or you give consent or you turn on in some manner. But we do have concerns that we don't want anyone being tracked without their knowledge or consent.
Hi, how are you? Can you talk a little bit about some best practices around onboarding initially? You talked a lot about authentication from an ongoing perspective, step up, off, things like that. But what about who is that person? Because you mentioned before things you know. Well, there's a lot of people out there that might know my first car, for example, right? So what are some of the best practices for assuring that I am the person I say I am when I first onboard to whatever?
That's a great question because I had to cut it out of the talk so that I had time for questions, so now I can talk about it. So normally, in the olden days, when you would register for an account, right, they would ask you to answer the secret questions so that you could recover your account later. So now what we want to do when we're onboarding people is we want to get good recovery information. So we want to know, is this a personal account for you, or is this a business account for your employer or your client? So those kinds of questions are the things we want to know so that when someone goes to recover the account later, we say, oh, was that Laura playing around and just using her Microsoft email address because it was handy? Or was that Laura actually doing something for Microsoft that they are going to want to have access to later? Those sorts of things. In terms of identity proofing, though, which I think kind of gets at the core of your question, there are a number of different ways of doing it, right? So you could have an entirely anonymous or pseudonymous account, and there are certainly use cases for those. So we know that political dissidents in Iran, when there was a contested election, went to Twitter to complain about what was going on in the country because they didn't want their real names used because they could have been punished. So we don't always want to do identity proofing every time. And we want to do different levels for different reasons. So sometimes we may want to have it automated where we're looking at a driver's license and looking at a selfie and going, yeah, close enough. This isn't a super high risk account, or like maybe they're trying to rent a bike or something, in which case we just need a low level of identity proofing, all the way up to we want you to walk into a bank, we want someone to see you, we want to look at your ID, we want to see who you are. So there's a wide variety of things you can do when establishing the account to figure out who someone is.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. We are going to kick back up in about 5 minutes. I'm sure many more people had questions for Sarah. Find her in the bar later and buy her.